The plane's engines finally went quiet as it touched down at Denver International Airport. After what felt like the longest flight of his life, Staff Sergeant David Coleman was finally home. He stretched his tired muscles and looked out the small, airplane window at the familiar mountains in the distance. It had been 15 months since he last saw those peaks, 15 months since he had breathed American air. David slowly stood up from his cramped middle seat, his desert camouflage uniform, wrinkled from the long journey. The uniform told his story without words. Multiple deployment patches, a name tape that read Coleman, and ribbons that spoke of service and sacrifice. His fellow passengers noticed immediately. An elderly man in the aisle seat smiled and nodded, respectfully. A young mother with her toddler whispered thank you as he passed by their row. As David made his way down the narrow airplane aisle, he felt the weight of his small duffel bag on his shoulder. Everything he owned for the past year was in that bag. Clean socks, a few personal items, letters from home, and a small American flag that had flown over his base in Afghanistan. The bag wasn't heavy, but it carried memories that would last a lifetime. The flight attendant smiled warmly as he reached the exit door. "Welcome home, soldier," one of them said softly. David nodded and gave a tired smile back. He had heard those words so many times during his layovers, but they never got old. After months of sleeping in a desert tent and eating meals from packages, those simple words reminded him that he was finally back where he belonged. Walking through the jet bridge felt surreal. The familiar sounds of an American airport filled his ears. Announcements over the intercom, children laughing, conversations in English. In Afghanistan, the sounds were different. Helicopters overhead, radio chatter, and the constant hum of generators. Here everything felt peaceful and normal, exactly how he remembered it. David entered the terminal and took a deep breath. The air conditioning felt amazing after months of desert heat. He looked around at the busy terminal, watching families reunite, business travelers rushing to their next flight, and airport workers going about their daily routines. Everyone seemed so relaxed, so free. It was a sharp contrast to the tension and constant alertness he had lived with overseas. An airport employee noticed his uniform and approached him. "Excuse me, soldier, do you need help finding anything?" she asked kindly. David shook his head politely. "No, ma'am, I'm just trying to get to baggage claim. My family's waiting for me." The woman smiled broadly. "Well, welcome home then, and thank you for your service." David thanked her and continued walking through the terminal. As he walked, David couldn't help but notice how different everything looked. The airport had been renovated since his last deployment. New shops, new restaurants, new signs everywhere. America had kept moving forward while he was away, just like it always did. That was one of the things he loved most about his country. Life went on. People pursued their dreams. Children grew up safe and sound. A group of teenagers walked past, laughing about something on their phones. David smiled to himself. Those kids had no idea what it was like in other parts of the world, where teenagers their age couldn't walk freely or laugh without worry. That innocence, that freedom, was exactly what he had been fighting to protect. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text message from his wife Linda. "We're here waiting. The kids are so excited they can barely sit still. Flight landed on time?" David quickly typed back. "Just got off the plane. Give me 20 minutes to get through the airport. Can't wait to see you all." He put the phone away and picked up his pace slightly. The terminal was busier than usual for a Tuesday afternoon. David weaved through the crowds, being careful not to bump into anyone with his duffel bag. A businessman in an expensive suit was talking loudly on his phone about some important meeting. A family was gathered around their grandmother, taking pictures and celebrating her visit. College students with heavy backpacks looked tired but excited, probably heading home for break. David passed by a coffee shop, and the smell made his mouth water. Real American coffee, not the instant stuff they had at the base. He thought about stopping but decided against it. His family had been waiting long enough. There would be plenty of time for coffee later, plenty of time for all the small pleasures he had missed. As he approached the security checkpoint area, David noticed the usual airport security presence. Officers in uniform, some with dogs, others watching the crowds. He had gotten used to security checks during his travels home. It was part of flying these days, especially for someone in military uniform. Security was usually pretty routine. They would check his ID, maybe ask a few questions about his service and send him on his way. A young boy, maybe 7 years old, tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed at David. "Mommy, look, a real soldier," he whispered loudly. The mother looked embarrassed but smiled at David apologetically. David winked at the little boy and gave him a small salute. The child's face lit up with excitement, and he tried to salute. Back though, he wasn't quite sure how to do it properly. These moments reminded David why he served. Not for the politicians or the headlines, but for families like this one. For children who could grow up free and safe, who could see soldiers as heroes instead of threats. For mothers who didn't have to worry about bombs or gunfire when they took their kids to the store. David checked his watch. His family had been waiting for over an hour already, counting the time it took for his plane to taxi to the gate and for him to get off. His 8-year-old son Tommy and 6-year-old daughter Katie were probably bouncing off the walls with excitement. Linda had been counting down the days on a calendar, marking each one off until Daddy came home. The closer he got to the exit, the more excited David became. Soon he would see their faces again, hold them in his arms, and sleep in his own bed. No more wake-up calls at 5 in the morning, no more desert sand and everything he owned. No more wondering if today would be the day something bad happened. He shifted his duffel bag to his other shoulder and continued walking toward the main terminal exit, completely unaware that his journey home was about to take an unexpected and troubling turn. David was just 50 feet away from the main exit when he heard footsteps behind him getting closer. He didn't think much of it at first. Airports were busy places and people walked fast when they were trying to catch flights or meet family members. But something about these footsteps felt different. They seemed to be matching his pace, following his exact path through the terminal. He glanced over his shoulder and saw 2 airport security officers walking directly behind him. One was a tall, heavy-set man with graying hair, probably in his late 40s. The other was younger, maybe early 30s, with a serious expression on his face. Both wore the standard airport security uniforms with badges and radios clipped to their belts. David turned back around and kept walking. Security officers patrolled airports all the time. It was their job to keep everyone safe. There was nothing unusual about seeing them in the terminal. But as he continued toward the exit, he noticed the footsteps were still there, still matching his pace exactly. "Excuse me, sir," a voice called out from behind him. David stopped and turned around. The older security officer was now just a few feet away, his hand resting on his radio. "We need to have a quick word with you." David set down his duffel bag and smiled politely. "Sure, officer. Is there a problem?" He had been through plenty of security checks during his travels. Usually they just wanted to verify his military ID or ask a quick question about his deployment. Nothing to worry about. The younger officer stepped closer, looking David up and down with suspicious eyes. "We need to see some identification," he said in a tone that didn't sound like a request. There was something cold about the way he spoke, something that made David feel uncomfortable. "Of course," David replied, reaching into his chest pocket for his military ID card. "I'm Staff Sergeant David Coleman, just returning from deployment in Afghanistan." He handed over his identification, the same ID he had shown to airline staff, gate agents, and security personnel at 3 different airports during his journey home. The older officer took the ID and examined it closely, turning it over in his hand several times. He held it up to the light, squinted at it, and then looked back at David with doubt in his eyes. "This uniform," he said, gesturing at David's camouflage clothing. "Where exactly did you get it?" David was confused by the question. "It's my uniform, sir. I've been wearing military uniforms for 8 years since I enlisted right out of high school." He pointed to his name tape and rank insignia. "Everything is regulation, issued by the United States Army." The younger officer stepped even closer, now standing uncomfortably close to David. "You seem pretty nervous," he said, studying David's face intently. Why are you acting so jumpy? I'm not nervous, officer, David replied calmly. I'm just tired from a long flight and eager to see my family. They've been waiting for me for over an hour now. He gestured toward the exit where dozens of families were gathered waiting for their loved ones to arrive. But the officers didn't seem interested in his explanation. The older one was still examining his military ID as if he had never seen one before. This could be fake, he said to his partner, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Anyone can buy these uniforms online these days. David felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice steady and respectful. His military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, to be polite even when others weren't. Sir, that's my real military identification. You can call the base, you can verify my service record. I just completed my 3rd deployment to Afghanistan. A small crowd of passengers began to gather around them, curious about what was happening. Some were taking out their phones, either to record the situation or to check the time, wondering if their own flights might be delayed by whatever was going on. An elderly woman with a walker stopped nearby and whispered to her daughter, "That young man is in military uniform. Why are they bothering him?" Her daughter shushed her, but they both continued to watch the scene unfold. The younger officer seemed to enjoy having an audience. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us for additional screening," he announced loudly. "There are some questions about your identification and your behavior that need to be resolved." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Additional screening for what?" he asked, his voice still calm but with a hint of frustration creeping in. "I've already been through security at my departure airport. I've shown you my valid military ID. What exactly is the problem here?" "The problem," the older officer said, stepping closer so that David could smell the coffee on his breath, "is that we have reason to believe you might be impersonating a service member. That's a federal crime, you know." The accusation hit David like a punch to the stomach. Impersonating a service member? He had spent the last 15 months sleeping in a tent, eating military rations, and risking his life for his country. He had missed his son's birthday, his daughter's first day of school, and countless family dinners. The idea that anyone would question his service felt like a betrayal. "Officers, please," David said, his military training keeping him respectful even as anger built up inside him. "I understand you're just doing your job, but there's been a misunderstanding. I am exactly who I say I am. My family is waiting for me just outside those doors." The younger officer reached for his handcuffs. "Sir, you're going to need to come with us to the security office. This situation requires further investigation." A businessman in an expensive suit who had been watching the whole thing stepped forward. "Excuse me, officers, but this seems excessive. The man is clearly in military uniform. He's shown you his ID. What more do you need?" The older officer turned to the businessman with an angry expression. "Sir, this is official security business. Please move along or you'll be detained as well." The businessman raised his hands and stepped back, but he didn't walk away. Neither did the growing crowd of passengers who were now openly staring at the situation. Some were shaking their heads in disapproval. Others were whispering to each other about what they were witnessing. David looked around at all the faces watching him. Some showed sympathy, others curiosity, and a few seemed to be judging him, wondering if maybe the security officers were right to be suspicious. He felt embarrassed and frustrated, but most of all he felt hurt. This wasn't how he had imagined his homecoming would go. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably Linda wondering where he was, why he was taking so long to get through the airport. His children were probably getting restless, asking their mother every few minutes when Daddy would finally appear. The thought of them waiting while he was being treated like a criminal made his chest tight with emotion. "Officers, please." David tried one more time. "Can we at least call my commanding officer? He can verify who I am in 2 minutes. Or check with the airline. They have records of military personnel on their flights. There has to be a way to clear this up quickly." But the officers had already made up their minds. The younger one stepped behind David and reached for his arm. "Sir, you're coming with us. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." As they began to escort him away from the crowd, David caught the eye of the elderly woman with the walker. She was shaking her head sadly, and he could see tears forming in her eyes. Somehow, that look of sympathy from a complete stranger hurt more than anything the officers had said to him. The security office was small and windowless, with gray walls and fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and cold. David sat in a plastic chair facing a metal desk, his duffel bag on the floor beside him. The two officers had brought him here despite his calm protests, and now they were treating him like he was some kind of criminal. The older officer sat behind the desk, still holding David's military ID like it was evidence in a crime. The younger one stood by the door, blocking any chance of leaving. On the wall behind them hung a clock that ticked loudly in the silence. David watched the minutes go by, knowing that with each tick, his family was waiting longer and getting more worried. "So," the older officer began, leaning back in his chair, "tell us again where you got this uniform." David took a deep breath and repeated what he had already explained twice. "It's my uniform, issued to me by the United States Army when I was deployed to Afghanistan 15 months ago. I'm Staff Sergeant David Coleman, stationed at Fort Carson. I just flew in from overseas and I'm trying to get home to my family." The officer wrote something down on a notepad, taking his time with each word. "Fort Carson, you say? What unit?" "4th Infantry Division, 2nd Brigade Combat Team," David answered immediately. These were basic facts about his service, information that any real soldier would know instantly about their own unit. The younger officer pushed himself off the wall and walked closer. "That's pretty convenient. You've got an answer for everything, don't you?" His voice was full of suspicion, like having answers somehow made David more guilty instead of less. "I have answers because I'm telling the truth," David replied, keeping his voice steady. His military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but this situation was testing every ounce of his patience. "Officers, I understand you're trying to do your job, but there's been a serious mistake here." The older officer looked up from his notepad. "The mistake would be letting someone walk through our airport impersonating a United States soldier. Do you have any idea how serious that crime is?" David felt his frustration building, but he pushed it down. Getting angry wouldn't help his situation. "Sir, I'm not impersonating anyone. I am a United States soldier. I've served 3 tours of duty. I've been awarded the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart for my service in combat." The two officers looked at each other and almost seemed to smirk. "Bronze Star and Purple Heart?" the younger one said. "Now you're really laying it on thick. What's next? Are you going to tell us you're some kind of war hero?" Those words hit David harder than any physical blow could have. The bronze star around his neck wasn't just a piece of metal. It represented the day he had crawled through enemy fire to pull 2 wounded soldiers to safety. The Purple Heart was for the shrapnel wound in his leg that still ached when it rained. These weren't fake decorations or stories he had made up. They were earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. "Officers," David said quietly, "those medals are real. Just like my service is real. Just like the 15 months I spent away from my wife and children, protecting people's freedom, is real." The older officer stood up and walked around the desk. "You know what I think? I think you bought that uniform online, maybe got those fake medals from the same place. There are websites that sell military stuff to wannabes who want to play dress-up." David's hands clenched into fists on his lap, but he kept them there. "That's not what happened, and you know it. Why would someone fake being a soldier just to walk through an airport? What would be the point? Free drinks, free meals, people thanking you for your service," the younger officer suggested. "Some people will do anything for attention and special treatment." The accusation was so insulting that David almost couldn't find words to respond. The idea that he would fake military service for free drinks was beyond offensive. He thought about all the real soldiers he had served with, good men and women who had sacrificed everything for their country. Some of them never made it home at all. "Officers, please just call Fort Carson. Call my commanding officer. His name is Colonel Martinez. He can verify everything I'm telling you in 5 minutes." David reached for his phone to find the number, but the younger officer quickly grabbed his wrist. "No phone calls," he said sharply. "We'll handle the verification process ourselves, in our own time." They took his phone away and placed it on the desk out of his reach. David watched helplessly as the screen lit up with incoming text messages, probably Linda wondering where he was, asking if everything was okay. His children were probably getting tired of waiting, maybe starting to worry that something had happened to their daddy. The older officer sat back down and opened a file folder. "While we're waiting, why don't you tell us about your deployment? Where exactly were you stationed in Afghanistan?" David knew this was a test, an attempt to catch him in a lie. Bagram Airfield for the first 6 months. Then we moved to a forward operating base near Kandahar for the rest of the deployment. Bagram Airfield, the officer repeated, writing it down. "What was your job there?" "I was a squad leader, responsible for convoy security operations. We escorted supply convoys between bases, protected logistics personnel during their missions." David could have told them about the roadside bombs, the firefights, the nights spent awake wondering if morning would come. But he kept his answers, simple and factual. The younger officer walked to the other side of the room and leaned against the wall. "Convoy security sounds dangerous." "It was," David replied simply. There was no point in elaborating. These men had clearly made up their minds about him before they even brought him into this room. So if it was so dangerous, how come you don't look more damaged? The older officer asked. "Most soldiers coming back from combat have some kind of issues, you know. PTSD, injuries, problems adjusting. You seem pretty normal for someone who's supposedly been through all that." David stared at him in disbelief. Now they were questioning why he wasn't more traumatized. "Sir, every soldier handles their experiences differently. Some of us are better at hiding what we've been through." The truth was, David did have nightmares, sometimes. He did jump when cars backfired or when fireworks went off unexpectedly. But he had learned to manage those reactions, to function normally for the sake of his family. That didn't make his service any less real or his sacrifices any less meaningful. A knock on the door interrupted the questioning. A female voice called out, "Officers Blake and Rodriguez, are you in there? We need to speak with you." The younger officer, apparently Rodriguez, opened the door slightly. "We're in the middle of an investigation. Can it wait?" "No, it can't wait," the voice replied firmly. "Open the door, please." David could hear multiple voices in the hallway now, and they didn't sound happy. He wondered if word was getting out about what was happening, if other airport staff were starting to question why a uniformed soldier was being detained for so long. Officer Blake, the older one, looked annoyed but walked over to the door. "What's this about?" "It's about the fact that you've been holding a United States soldier in this office for over an hour without proper cause," the female voice said. "And it's about to become a much bigger problem for both of you." David felt a spark of hope for the first time since this whole ordeal began. Maybe someone in authority had finally noticed what was happening. Maybe someone was going to ask the right questions and get to the truth. As voices continued to argue in the hallway, he sat quietly in his chair, still maintaining the discipline and composure that the Army had taught him, even though inside he was feeling a mixture of relief and vindication building up. The door opened, and a woman in her 50s walked into the small office wearing a supervisor's badge, and an expression that showed she was not happy with what she had found. Behind her stood 2 other airport employees, both looking uncomfortable and concerned. The woman's name tag read Patricia Collins, Airport Security Supervisor. "Officers Blake and Rodriguez," Patricia said in a firm voice. "I need an explanation for why you've detained this gentleman for over an hour without following proper procedures." Officer Blake straightened up defensively. "Ma'am, we have reasonable suspicion that this individual may be impersonating a military service member. We're conducting a thorough investigation." Patricia looked at David, taking in his uniform, his posture, and the calm way he sat despite being held against his will. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her. She had been working airport security for 15 years and had dealt with plenty of real security threats. This didn't look like one of them. "What evidence do you have to support this suspicion?" Patricia asked, crossing her arms. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. "His behavior seemed suspicious when we first observed him. He was walking nervously through the terminal, and when we questioned him, his answers seemed rehearsed." David finally spoke up, his voice respectful but tired. "Ma'am, I wasn't walking nervously. I was walking to meet my family who have been waiting for me for almost 2 hours now. I just returned from a 15-month deployment in Afghanistan, and all I want to do is go home." Patricia turned to the officers. "Have you verified his military identification?" "We're in the process of doing that," Blake replied, though he made no move toward the phone or computer that could actually accomplish such verification. "In the process?" Patricia's voice rose slightly. "Officer Blake, it takes 5 minutes to verify military credentials. Why hasn't this been done already?" The two officers looked at each other uncomfortably. The truth was, they had been so convinced they were right about David that they hadn't bothered to do the basic verification that would have ended this situation immediately. Patricia walked over to the desk and picked up David's military ID, examining it closely. Unlike the two officers, she actually knew what to look for. The holographic security features, the proper formatting, the official seals. Everything looked completely legitimate. "Staff Sergeant Coleman," she said, reading from the ID. "4th Infantry Division. When did you say you returned from deployment?" "Today, ma'am. I flew in from Germany, which was my last stop before coming home. I've been traveling for almost 24 hours straight." Patricia nodded and pulled out her phone. "I'm going to call Fort Carson right now and verify your service record. This should have been done an hour ago." As she dialed, David felt a wave of relief wash over him. Finally, someone was taking the simple step that would prove he was exactly who he said he was. He watched Patricia's face as she spoke to someone on the other end of the line. "Yes, this is Patricia Collins, Airport Security Supervisor at Denver International. I need to verify the identity of one of your soldiers." "Staff Sergeant David Coleman, 4th Infantry Division?" Patricia paused, listening intently to the response. David saw her expression change completely. Her eyes widened and she looked at him with a mixture of surprise and something that looked like recognition. She continued listening to the person on the phone, asking a few more questions, but her entire demeanor had shifted. After a few more minutes, Patricia hung up the phone. She looked at Officers Blake and Rodriguez with an expression that could have melted steel. "Gentlemen, do you have any idea who you've been holding in this room?" Officer Blake shifted uncomfortably. "Just some guy claiming to be a soldier." "This is not just some guy," Patricia interrupted, her voice now barely controlled anger. "This is Staff Sergeant David Coleman, Bronze Star and Purple Heart recipient. The same David Coleman who was featured on the national news 3 months ago for saving 12 soldiers during an enemy ambush in Afghanistan." The room went completely silent. David looked down at his hands, feeling embarrassed by the attention, but also vindicated. He had tried to tell them about his medals, but they had dismissed his words as lies. Patricia continued, "The same David Coleman who crawled through enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers, despite being injured himself, the same soldier who has been personally commended by the Secretary of Defense and has been recommended for additional honors." Officer Rodriguez's face had gone pale. We didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't bother to check." Patricia's professional composure was cracking. "Instead, you made assumptions and held a decorated American hero like a common criminal." She turned to David, her voice softening completely. "Staff Sergeant Coleman, I cannot begin to apologize for what has happened here today. This is absolutely unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for my officer's actions." David stood up slowly, his military bearing evident even after the ordeal he had just endured. "Ma'am, I appreciate your help in resolving this situation. I understand that security is important, but I hope we can learn from this experience." Patricia was amazed by his grace under pressure. Even after being mistreated and humiliated, he was responding with dignity and understanding. She had dealt with plenty of angry passengers over the years, and she would have completely understood if David had been furious. Instead, he was showing the kind of character that had probably made him a hero on the battlefield. "Your family," Patricia said suddenly, remembering why David had been trying to leave the terminal in the first place. "They must be worried sick. Let me personally escort you to them and explain what happened." As they prepared to leave the security office, Patricia turned back to Officers Blake and Rodriguez. "You two will remain here. There will be a full investigation into this incident and there will be consequences. This kind of behavior is not acceptable in my airport. Walking through the terminal with Patricia, David could see that word of the situation had spread. Airport employees were stopping their work to look at him, some with expressions of respect, others with embarrassment for what had happened. A few passengers who had witnessed the initial confrontation pointed him out to their companions. "Staff Sergeant," Patricia said as they walked, "I want you to know that this does not represent the values of our airport or our security team. We have the utmost respect for our military personnel, and what happened today was completely contrary to our policies and our beliefs." David nodded. "I understand, ma'am. I know that most Americans support their military. This was just an unfortunate misunderstanding." But even as he said the words, David knew it wasn't really a misunderstanding. He had been treated the way he was treated for reasons that had nothing to do with security concerns and everything to do with prejudices that some people still carried. It was a painful reminder that even after serving his country with honor, some people would still see him as a threat rather than a protector. As they approached the main terminal where his family was waiting, David could see Linda pacing back and forth, checking her phone constantly. His son Tommy was sitting on a bench swinging his legs and looking worried. His daughter Katie was playing with a small toy, but she kept looking up hopefully every time someone walked through the doors. "There they are," David said, and despite everything that had happened, he smiled. Finally, after all these months and after this terrible ordeal, he was about to be reunited with the people who mattered most to him in the world. As David walked through the terminal doors into the main arrivals area, his 8-year-old son Tommy was the first to spot him. The little boy jumped up from the bench where he had been sitting and ran toward his father, his face lighting up with pure joy. "Daddy! Daddy's home!" Tommy shouted, his voice echoing through the busy terminal. David dropped to one knee and caught his son in a tight hug, lifting him off the ground and spinning him around. For a moment, all the stress and humiliation of the past 2 hours melted away. This was what he had been dreaming about during those long nights in Afghanistan, holding his children again, feeling their arms around his neck. 6-year-old Katie was right behind her brother, running as fast as her little legs could carry her. "Daddy, you're finally here!" she squealed, throwing herself into David's arms as he knelt down to hug both children at once. Linda, his wife, walked over more slowly, tears streaming down her face. She could see the exhaustion in David's eyes, and she knew something had happened. After being married to a soldier for 10 years, she had learned to read the signs when things weren't quite right. "Hey, beautiful," David said softly, standing up with Katie still in his arms and reaching out to pull Linda close. The family hug lasted for what felt like minutes, all of them holding each other tight, not wanting to let go. "We were so worried," Linda whispered in his ear. "Your plane landed 2 hours ago. We kept calling, but your phone went straight to voicemail. What happened?" Before David could answer, Patricia Collins stepped forward. She had been watching the reunion from a respectful distance, but she knew she needed to explain what had occurred and make sure the family understood the situation. "Mrs. Coleman," Patricia said gently, "I'm Patricia Collins, Airport Security Supervisor. I need to apologize to you and your family for what happened today. Your husband was detained by 2 of our officers due to a serious error in judgment on their part." Linda looked confused, still holding on to David's arm like she was afraid he might disappear again. "Detained? What do you mean, detained?" David set Katie down but kept his arm around his wife. "It's okay, honey. There was a misunderstanding about my identity. These officers thought I might be impersonating a soldier." "Impersonating?" Linda's voice rose in disbelief. "You've been married to the Army for our entire marriage. You've got more military gear in our garage than some small countries have in their entire arsenal. How could anyone think you were fake?" Tommy tugged on David's uniform sleeve. "Daddy, why would someone think you were pretending to be a soldier? You are a soldier. You have all those medals at home." David knelt down to his son's level. "Sometimes people make mistakes, buddy. Sometimes they judge others without knowing the whole story. But it's all worked out now, and that's what matters." But even as David spoke calmly to his son, a crowd was beginning to gather around them. Word had spread quickly through the terminal about what had happened. Several other military personnel who were traveling through the airport had heard the story and came over to show their support. An older man in a Navy uniform approached the family. "Staff Sergeant Coleman, I'm Chief Petty Officer Johnson. I just wanted to shake your hand and say thank you for your service. What happened here today was completely unacceptable." Behind him stood a young Marine in dress blues who had been traveling to his own family reunion. "Sir, I read about what you did in Afghanistan. You're a real hero and you deserve better treatment than this." Patricia watched as more and more people gathered around David and his family. Airport employees, passengers, other military members, everyone wanted to show their support and express their outrage about what had occurred. She realized this incident was going to have consequences far beyond just disciplining two security officers. A woman with a small child approached Linda. "Ma'am, I was here when those officers first stopped your husband. I saw the whole thing, and it was wrong from the very beginning. That man was just trying to get home to his family." Linda looked around at all the people who had gathered to support them. She was overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers, but she was also angry about what her husband had endured. "This shouldn't have happened," she said to Patricia. "My husband has served this country with honor. He's risked his life for people he's never met. He doesn't deserve to be treated like a criminal in his own country." "You're absolutely right," Patricia replied. "And I promise you there will be a full investigation. The officers involved will face serious consequences for their actions." As if summoned by her words, a news reporter appeared at the edge of the crowd. Someone had called the local television station about the incident, and they had sent a crew to cover the story. David noticed the camera and instinctively stepped back. The last thing he wanted was to turn this into a media circus. "Staff Sergeant Coleman," the reporter called out, "would you be willing to talk about what happened here today?" David shook his head politely. "I just want to take my family home. We've been apart for 15 months and we have a lot of catching up to do." But Tommy, who was only 8 years old and didn't understand the complexities of the situation, piped up loudly, "My daddy is a hero. He saved lots of soldiers in the war. Why were those policemen being mean to him?" The innocent question from a child cut through all the adult conversations and got to the heart of the matter. Here was a little boy who was proud of his father, confused about why anyone would treat him badly, and hurt that his family's reunion had been disrupted by prejudice and poor judgment. Linda picked up Katie and took Tommy's hand. "We're going home now," she announced. "My family has been through enough for one day." Patricia nodded. "Of course. Staff Sergeant, I'll be in touch with you personally about the investigation. You have my direct phone number, and I want you to know that this airport stands behind our military families 100%. As the Coleman family began to walk toward the exit, they were followed by an impromptu honor guard of military personnel and supporters. Chief Petty Officer Johnson walked beside David, sharing stories about his own deployments. The young Marine helped carry Katie when she got tired. Other passengers smiled and nodded respectfully as they passed. At the exit doors, David turned back one more time to look at the terminal. In a few days, this incident would probably be forgotten by most people. The news story would run for a cycle or two, then be replaced by other events. But for David, this homecoming would always be remembered not just for the joy of reuniting with his family, but for the painful reminder that even after serving his country with distinction, some people would still see him as a threat rather than a protector. Tommy tugged on his father's hand. "Daddy, are we really going home now? For real this time?" David smiled down at his son and squeezed his hand. "Yes, buddy, we're really going home now. For real this time." As they walked out, into the Colorado sunshine, David felt Linda slip her hand into his free one. Katie was chattering excitedly about all the things she wanted to show him at home. Tommy was already making plans for all the games they were going to play together. Despite everything that had happened, David realized he was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by the people who loved him in the country he had sworn to protect. The incident at the airport had been painful and unjust, but it had also shown him something important. For every person who judged him unfairly, There were many more who recognized his service and stood up for what was right. As they got into Linda's car for the drive home, David looked back at the airport one last time. He hoped that what had happened today would lead to better training, better understanding, and better treatment for all the military personnel who passed through those doors. If his difficult experience could prevent another soldier's family reunion from being disrupted by prejudice, then perhaps some good could come from this painful day.